All right, good afternoon, everybody. Let's give it 2 more minutes before we begin. All right, good afternoon, everybody. I think it's 3 minutes past 5, so we can go ahead and make a start. Now, I would like to welcome each one of you today to listen in to the presentation of the BarimaMora passage. We have 3 presenters today that will present in their findings. Without further ado, I forgot, let me introduce myself. My name is Marie Fraser. I'm a marine biologist, and I'm a part of the Guyana Marine Conservation Society, as well as the Ministry of Natural Resources. Now, I know all of you been hearing a lot of talks about the BarimaMora passage. Now, today's your opportunity to listen in and to hear more about what the BarimaMora passage is and some of the findings that we did from our studies. So let me give you a little insight before I introduce the presenters. Now, the BarimaMora Passage is a special protected area located in the northern part of Region 1, near the Venezuela border. It is approximately 5 kilometers north of the town of the regional capital of BarimaMora and adjacent to the Morawana settlement at the intersection of the mouth of the Barima and Arco River. This area contains Guyana's largest and most intact mangrove ecosystem, with the 3 mangrove species being present, that is the red, black, and white mangrove. These species are found in the surrounding freshwater swamps and tidal wetland along the rivers, tidal creek, and estuarine areas. It is a rich biodiversity watershed and blue economy asset, makes it worthy of being a World Heritage Site. The Waro populated area is biologically diverse with species such as the scarlet ibis, the macaws, the jaguars, parrots, otters, and manatees, some of which are ICUN and CITES listed species. The BarimaMora Passage is valued around 3.4 billion per annum since it provides ecosystem services such as carbon sequestration, coastal protection, fishery sustainability, and provision for raw materials. But let me not tell you more about the BarimaMora Passage. I know my presenters, they have a handful of information to share with you this evening. So just a little friendly reminder to kindly mute your mics. If you have any questions, please leave them in the chat. After the end of the 3 presenters, we'll have a question and discussion answer. We'll also be using our reaction button, which is at the bottom of your screen. I would like to say that before we welcome the presenters, use your reaction button to give a little hand clap. I know we're not here in person, but we can make use of those reaction buttons. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Matthew Hallett, who will be sharing his findings on the mammals and ground bird study. Now, Dr. Hallett is an assistant research professor in the Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation at the University of Florida, specializing in monitoring of medium and large mammal using camera trap. He has 10 years of experience working in the Rupununi region of Guyana and has published several fantastic papers on the impacts of hunting of game species, the presence of rare species, and the population density of large carnivores. So I'd like you all to use your reaction button there at the bottom to welcome Dr. Matt Hallett. So let me see them. Great. So all over to you, Doc.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you everyone for having me. I'm looking forward to sharing our results. This survey was my first time in Region 1. I've been working in Rupununi for a long time. And so seeing a new part of Guyana was really exciting. And our research results show that this part of Guyana is very special. So I will get right to it. Oops. Wrong screen. Okay, are you seeing, Maria, are you seeing the slides?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. All right, so again, I'm Dr. Matt Hallett from University of Florida, and it's my pleasure to share the results of our research findings on the medium and large mammals and ground birds of the BarimaMora Passage. So our plan before setting foot on the ground in BarimaMora Passage was to set 30 camera traps along the Barima and Kaituma rivers, set 2 to 3 kilometers apart over the course of about 3 months from, 3 months from February to May 2021. We were able to accomplish that and accumulated over 3,000 total nights or days, depending on which way you like to count them, of survey effort, and produced over 40,000 individual photographs of wildlife of this region. As I said, this is my first time in Region 1, so flying over the region, coming into Mabaruma, things look pretty straightforward. You could see the Barima and the Kaituma River, forest below, which I've grown accustomed to from coming in and out of the Rupununi. Stepping into boats from Mabaruma made things look fairly easy. The engines were much larger in Region 1, so we were traveling much faster. It even seemed like work would be very efficient. Then when we began to turn off of the rivers, we found that things were going to be a little more challenging, finding some dry land that would be inhabited by terrestrial species. The farther we went up and up, the terrain of Region 1 proved even more challenging, and then even more, of course, when we stepped out of the boats and began walking around, attempting to find places to set cameras. I'm sure you're recognizing a pattern by now that this was very rugged, beautiful but rugged terrain that presented a number of new challenges for our team. In this picture here in the red shirt, you see Mr. Fernando Lai, who has been working with me for all the 10 years that I've been working in the Rupununi. He's my oldest friend in Guyana, and is the leader of our team, our research team in the Rupununi. He was able to come up to Region 1. That was also his first time seeing this part of Guyana. And he was also experiencing some new adventures with the mud and the mangroves, and some of the unique challenges that the terrain presented. While we were setting cameras, he and I were discussing in the evenings, wondering what we'd be seeing on these cameras amongst the mud and the mangrove roots. But amazingly, in those over 40,000 photos, there were over 4,000 independent records of animals. As you can see, the photos were dominated by a few of the relatively small species, red-rumped agouti, common opossum, also known as a yauri, spiny rat, bush deer, lowland paca, which is everyone's favorite, the laba, and white-lipped peccary, the large bush hog. But this is just merely the number of photographs. When we look at another measure that represents how often or the proportion of cameras where each species was detected, we see a much more even spread, and we see that the camera traps in the BarimaMora Passage documented a total of 64 species, which included 28 mammals, 36 birds, and 1 reptile. And that group of 64 also included 14 species of conservation concern. And so while we weren't sure what we were going to be finding as we were walking around, we were amazed to see that the BarimaMora Passage is home to a near full complement of tropical forest species. And we were, as a matter of fact, I'm still trying to figure out how some of these species are making a home in between the mangroves and in the mud in the BarimaMora Passage. So some of the species that were included here, I'll share some of the photos. Of course, Guyana's national animal, the jaguar, was photographed on a number of occasions at different sites, making a home in BarimaMora. This was one species that we were expecting to see here because we had seen over the years the photo evidence of jaguars preying on marine turtles at Shell Beach. And so since the BarimaMora Passage is just sort of behind the dunes at Shell Beach, we were expecting that jaguars would be walking through this area every now and then, and that was certainly the case. But we actually saw 5 out of Guyana's 6 wild cats on the camera. So the puma was present, also known as a deer tiger across Guyana. This one surprised us a little bit because pumas tend to not like water as much as their other wildcat relatives in Guyana. They prefer to stay dry. In the Rupununi, we see them more up in mountains and in dry lands, whereas jaguars spend more time in the wetlands where they're much more home and much stronger swimmers. But pumas are in the BarimaMora Passage as well. And so are a number of the small cats, including the ocelot, which was the most common cat on the camera traps in the BarimaMora Passage. And also the most common cat probably in all of our camera trap research in Guyana. The margay, which is a semi-arboreal cat. Here's a close-up of the margay because this camera trap photo isn't particularly great. They're a semi-arboreal cat, and this shows you that the BarimaMora Passage is home to a number of mature trees in their forested area because the margays are excellent climbers and they spend most of their time in the treetops hunting arboreal rats and opossums. And Guyana's smallest cat, the oncilla, sometimes called the baby tiger, not much bigger than a house cat. We did see the oncilla here in the BarimaMora Passage, which is very interesting because our photos of oncillas across Guyana has been somewhat limited. With all the rivers and creeks in the BarimaMora area, you would expect these guys, the water dog, the most critically endangered species and the most endangered mammal in all of South America, does make its home in the BarimaMora Passage. And we caught groups of giant river otters on several occasions and also saw them in person during our time conducting the camera trap surveys. Another cousin of the giant river otter, the greater grison. So this is a weasel species, which we know most often from the savannas, the Rupununi savannas, and not so often in forested areas. And this was one species where we were very surprised to see it in the BarimaMora area because we know it as sort of a dry land, more upland, arid savanna, avoiding wetland areas species. But here it was, and we photographed it on multiple occasions. So it was no fluke that the greater grison is at home in the BarimaMora area. One of the more common species on camera traps was the crab-eating raccoon. And this was one species that we knew we were going to see on camera traps because we saw its tracks all over the place in the mud, all over the BarimaMora Passage as we were setting cameras. Crab-eating raccoons, like their cousins in North America, are scavengers, they're omnivores, and they like to wash their food and they wash their hands. And so they're very often associated with water. they're eating crabs, as their name denotes, but they eat a wide variety of things. But they have this peculiar habit of wanting to stay clean. So they're constantly washing their hands before and after they eat and washing their food. And so they often stick close to water. And in such a swampy area like the BarimaMora Passage, we were not surprised to see these guys popping up on cameras. Another water-loving species is the tyra. These guys look sort of like a dog, but they are also in the weasel family. So with otters and grison, tyras are semi-arboreal. They climb trees. They also are very good swimmers. They have webbed toes. They do a little bit of everything. They're omnivores as well, and they were relatively common in the BarimaMora Passage. The largest species that we saw on our camera traps was the red brocket deer, also known as bush deer across Guyana. These were also the most common ungulate, which surprised us as well for a place where when we were walking around setting camera traps and sinking in up to our knees or higher in mud, you wouldn't expect to see a large deer that goes over 100 pounds, but here they are. The local team knew that bush deer were around, and the camera traps verified that. We also saw white-lipped peccaries in fairly large groups. So there are two bush hogs in Guyana. White-lipped peccaries are the larger of the two. They roam around in very large herds, sometimes of over 200 animals. We saw some both on camera traps and sign on the ground when we were setting the cameras, indications that there are healthy populations of this white-lipped peccary. We also saw indications in the market in Mabaruma that there are healthy populations of white-lipped peccary because they were the most common wild meat that we observed in the market at the time, and heard from hunters that this was sort of the most desired species, and camera traps showed that this was also the case. The smaller of the two peccaries that you find in Guyana, the collared peccary, often called abuya, was also present in BarimaMora Passage, although less common. These guys tend to prefer upland habitats. They don't swim or wallow in the mud as much as white-lipped peccaries. They also, when white-lipped peccaries are around, they tend to be a little less common because they're in direct competition for the same food source. So the larger and more common white-lips will sort of outcompete these smaller guys, but they are present and they are around, showing that this terrestrial habitat is fairly intact. Everyone's favorite across Guyana, my favorite as well, the lowland paca, also called laba, was fairly common in the BarimaMora Passage. We expected that this would be the case because they're also a water-loving species. They make their own dens. They're very good swimmers. They also have webbed toes. They're very accustomed to plunging into the water to escape predators and are very adept swimmers. So they're well adapted for making their home in sort of a swampy, seasonally flooded environment like you find in the BarimaMora area. As I said, the most common species on all of the camera traps, which is also the trend across Guyana in the Rupununi, in region 7 and region 8 and region 4 and region 10, everywhere that we've worked, red rump agouti are the most common species on camera traps, which is a good sign because these are very important species for dispersing the seeds of large trees. They're one of the few that have teeth and jaws strong enough to crack the seeds of very large trees, those that are also desirable for timber in Guyana. And it's agoutis that are dispersing these seeds because they collect seeds, they eat some, they bury others to eat later. They forget where some of the seeds that they buried are, and then those trees actually grow up, or those seeds grow up into the next generation of large trees. So they play an important role in all forested ecosystem, and that's the same in the BarimaMora Passage area. One of the most interesting findings in all these camera traps, and the ones that I definitely did not expect, was to see the giant anteater in the BarimaMora Passage. Working all over Guyana, this species continues to baffle me. I don't know why it is where it is, or why it does what it does, or why it looks like what it looks like. I have no idea, but they seem to be everywhere, on top of the highest mountains, in the driest savannas, in the swampiest wetlands, now in the mangroves. Giant anteaters seem to be everywhere. And the answer is probably because when you eat ants and termites, your food is everywhere. They'd probably be in Georgetown too if they weren't bothered by noise and people. So giant anteaters were also present. They were photographed on a couple of different locations, and this was one that really surprised me. Their smaller cousin, the Tamandua, was also present in the BarimaMora Passage. Again, these guys are primarily arboreal, so their presence shows an indication that there are mature trees for these guys to climb. They come down to the ground mostly to walk in between trees. They're also preying on ants and termites, but those nests that are high up in the treetops. Moving along here, the Yauri. When I do presentations in the Rupununi, these are always a favorite because they're particularly smelly, so it always gives everyone a laugh when they see a picture of a Yauri. These were one of the most common species on the camera traps. They also are very well adapted to, well, they're very well adapted to live almost anywhere. They're very common in all around Georgetown, all around the coast, because they'll readily eat. They'll go in your garbage can. They'll eat almost anything and everything from insects to fruits and vegetables to frogs to dead animal flesh to anything in between. So you would expect them to be almost anywhere, and they were. We also observed a number of monkeys during the trip. We saw squirrel monkeys. We saw howler monkeys. Now it's been a little while, so I'm forgetting. Wedge-capped capuchin monkeys, also called jack monkeys across Guyana, were the only monkey that we caught on the camera traps. But we did observe a number of others, again, showing that there aren't just mangroves in the BarimaMora Passage. There are large trees and sort of more intact terrestrial habitats that support monkeys and other species. And Brian will be talking to you about the birds that were observed by he and Leon, but camera traps also catch a number of large ground birds. Among the most common were the great tinamou. This is also an IUCN threatened species, often called mom in Guyana. They're like bush chicken, right? They're a sort of a large chicken-shaped bird. Great tinamou is the largest of, I think there are 6 tinamous. Brian will check me on this one. I think there are 6, maybe 7 tinamou species in Guyana. Great tinamou are the largest and by some degree the rarest. Black curassow, also called pauis, was fairly common on camera traps. Even though this species is very common across Guyana, they are also an IUCN threatened species because their populations are plummeting elsewhere because they're very desirable for food. And last but not least, on the camera traps, another IUCN listed species, a threatened species, one that I certainly did not expect to see on the cameras here is the marbled wood quail. This is another ground bird typically associated with dry environments and mountains. I shared these photos with Brian and he was very surprised to see. And we photographed the marbled wood quail on several occasions in the BarimaMora Passage. So another IUCN listed species, an important bird species, and an indicator that there's not only mangroves and swamps in the BarimaMora Passage, but this also wonderful sort of mix of upland and lowland habitats, forests and mangroves and transitional environments. And it's these sort of mixing and transitional areas that are often the most important for biodiversity. And so I think that's what the camera traps are really bearing out. Of course, while we were walking around, we observed lots of amazing birds. We even saw some fish, and not just in the market in Mabaruma. And I've shared that information with Brian and Mark respectively, and they're going to share their information with you. But we also saw a few reptiles along our way, which I thought I'd add here because there was nobody else doing reptile surveys. So we saw at least 2 species of turtles. The yellow-footed tortoise is another IUCN listed species. They're a threatened species across their range. And they are a species that's targeted both for food and for, up to a few years ago, the wildlife trade in Guyana, which is now limited. And so they're an important species to note and know are around. The labaria is always important to know when it's around because you have to watch where you're stepping. We did see at least 1 labaria during our time and a number of lizards. This is the brown tree runner, sometimes called the Jesus lizard in Guyana because it's one of those that's able to run across the water tops. So overall, The camera traps and the large mammal surveys documented a relatively high number of mammal and bird species, especially relative to other mangrove and coastal habitats. A number of the species that we saw are usually associated with tropical forests. And so that shows that the BarimaMora Passage is not just important because of the services that the mangroves provide, but because it provides this mixing mosaic of different habitat types with upland and lowland forests, swamps, palm swamps, mangroves, and so on. In my opinion, the overall diversity certainly warrants the special protected area status that the BarimaMora Passage desires. And I would say that there are a few areas that warrant further research. One of the species that was noticeably absent from our survey was the lowland tapir. We know that that's a species that's targeted for hunting throughout Guyana. And if they are naturally rare in this habitat in the BarimaMora area because of the habitat type, the impact of the wild meat market and hunting in and around Mabaruma area warrants further research just for understanding and future management. We also, as part of collecting the camera traps, there were researchers from Hydromet that went out and took water quality measurements. Some of the data that was coming from there raises some concern about the impact of runoff from Port Kaituma. We were seeing that the water in the Kaituma River specifically was quite acidic. And so further research there, I believe, is needed. And then also the depth and breadth of fresh and saltwater mixing in the BarimaMora Passage area, certainly with the offshore activity going on with Guyana right now. Saltwater comes far into the BarimaMora Passage area, but even goes even farther beyond the areas where you see saltwater on the surface. And so better understanding of that mixing and how far saltwater reaches in and would bring things offshore inland to the BarimaMora Passage would be very useful. Thank you so much to our team. We had a wonderful team from Guyana Marine Conservation Society, some very, very talented young researchers. I had a great time working with them. A number of them have since traveled to the Rupununi and visited with our teams there and overlapped. And I hope that we can continue to work together to do cross-training, to share our experiences, and to continue learning and hopefully recognizing this very special place in the BarimaMora Passage. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that are in the chat or that will be offered after. And I hope that you enjoyed this summary of our findings.
Thank you, Dr. Matt Hallett, for that interesting presentation. It's quite interesting to know that we have several red-listed ICUN red-listed species in the BarimaMora Passage, hence make it as a potential, our proposed heritage site. Nevertheless, let's welcome our second presenter, which is Mr. Mark Ram. He will be presenting on the fishery studies. Mark Ram is a lecturer in the Department of Biology at the University of Guyana. His research interests include marine and coastal ecology, freshwater ecology, freshwater management, blue carbon, climate change mitigation, sea level rises, coastal wetland, and governance of marine resources. He also worked as an independent consultant conducting biodiversity assessments on several projects in Guyana. Mark was a team leader of the fishery studies in the BarimaMora Passage. So let's once again use your reaction to give Mark a warm hands of welcome.
Thank you, Maria.
Over to you, Mark.
Great. I'm having some internet issues, so if I'm coming over unclear, just let me know and I'll try to rejoin.
All right.
All right. Yes, so the fishery study actually complements what was done by Matt and Brian, looking at the biodiversity in the BarimaMora Passage. And this is a very important region, not just the BarimaMora Passage, but region 1 is very important for mangroves because it is one of the regions in Guyana that has the most intact mangrove. But sadly, it's also one of the regions that has been most impacted over the last 5 years, losing an estimated of 1,419 hectares of mangroves. This is compared to our other regions along the coast, which is from regions 2 to 6, which have seen an increase of 5,000 hectares of mangroves. So it shows the travesty of the mangrove loss in the region, but not only the loss of mangroves, but also the loss of habitats and related biodiversity. As you recognize, the mangroves are very important for crabs, for fishes, for other life forms that exist in the region. And it provides food source to many of the persons that actually rely on crabs and fishes. And this is why it's particularly important. It's also important in the mangrove in this region is also important because it's estimated to be about $3.4 billion of ecosystem services contributing to the people of Region 1 annually. And therefore, they are highly dependent on the mangroves to maintain or to sustain their livelihoods. Fish is also an important food source and protein source for the people of this region, utilizing both freshwater and estuarine fishes, as they are landing sites as well in this region. And hence, this study was actually done to investigate the composition of fishes that exist in the BarimaMora passage area and basically to set a baseline of the freshwater fishes for the region. So this is basically the BarimaMora passage area, and these are some of our fishing points that we have covered. We sampled a total of 19 sites in this area, and we utilized a combination of gear types to sample this area. Now, recognizing that mangroves are very difficult ecosystems to work with, it's particularly challenging for us to utilize some of the traditional fishing methods that we would use for other habitats. However, regardless of those challenges, we worked around those, utilizing mainly the gill nets to capture the larger fishes and the drag nets to capture the smaller fishes. We had more gill net sites than the dragnet sites because the habitats were unsuitable for sampling, and also the region is the river is actually tidal, which makes it extremely challenging for us to set nets and to collect fishes in some parts. Nonetheless, the team, we work around most of the challenges, and we collected a total of 329 species, 329 individuals from 32 species of fishes. And most of these fishes were actually collected from the Siluriform family, which is a family that our catfishes are part of, representing a larger part of the composition in the region. This was actually followed by our Carassiforms, which also includes many of the commercial species that we consume, and our Perciforms, which includes some of the fishes that we also consume. Across the different sites that we've sampled, we realized that some of the sites had varying diversity and abundance. In all of the sites, we found that the site farthest to the Atlantic actually had more species than those that are inland, with the exception of site 17. But the other sites would include site 1, 2, and 3. These are sites basically closer or more towards the Northern Atlantic Ocean. And this area is of obviously the estuarine environment, and there's a mixture of salt and freshwater in this area, supporting a higher diversity and abundance of fishes in this area. In terms of the abundance, we found that our what we locally call here tui, which is our Amphiarus rufus, which is a fish that actually utilizes the estuarine environment, was most abundant species. And this was followed by our Basha, or the Plagiocyan squamosus. This is a very important commercial species for the people in the region, followed by our Corimata, what we call Katakali in Guyana, also consumed by the local, were the 3 most abundant species. And the least abundant species, which we only recorded about one individual each, were Nebris microbes, which are butterfishes, our coffum, just to name a few. When we did a closer analysis, we found that over 53% of the species that we collected were actually commercial species. And these are very important for the people in the region, either utilizing this for subsistence or this is being sold at the local markets and landing sites. With a total of 47 percentage of non-commercial species, which have very little to no use in the region. These are some of the non-commercial species that we have recorded. With some local names, we have here high water, Emery. This is the, we have a ray in the middle here. This is the Katkali. Also have the black piranha. And we have the flounder here. So most of these are non-commercial because they are not consumed by the locals and they are not utilized in any other trade or any other activities in the region. For the commercial species, this is just showing you some of the species that we've recorded. We have the huri here, very important and very species which is only restricted to this area is the markot in the second image. We have the snook here. We also have basha, and there were several species of catfishes represented by this image here. We only recorded one individual of the markot, and based on our informal discussions with the fishers in the region, we recognize that the markot is basically harder to find now than it was several years ago. So there's a challenge basically in finding these species, and you're no longer finding them in the habitats that they were several years ago. So this is indicating that there are pressure on this particular species, and this species, because it's only restricted to this part of Guyana, because of its connection to the Orinoco or the Venezuelan region, the pressures on this species actually causing the species to migrate, and hence the longer time that they're taking to find this particular species. In terms of the IUCN status of the species that we've recorded, most of the species are not endangered or threatened in any way, but we found that one of the species was vulnerable, and this is the coffum that we locally call it, or the Atlantic tarpon. And this is a very important commercial species here in Guyana and in the Gulf of Mexico, all the way to Florida. Very important fish species, and they're actually, because of the vulnerability of this species, in some countries, they actually impose a ban on harvesting this particular species. So this particular species was one that inhabits the estuarine environment, very common along the coast of Guyana. However, it is very vulnerable, so it is one of the species that definitely you should consider in our proposal or of the special protected area or our heritage site consideration for the region. So in terms of our findings, we found that overall the area supported many vulnerable species, as well as commercial species, which are directly linked to the livelihoods of the people in this area. As I said, there were some challenges in terms of sampling the species, especially just the juveniles. So we will still require some additional research, but this could also support the records that already exist for the region from the Shell Beach protected area, which recorded about 59 species in 2011. But still, we need some more studies on the juvenile, and obviously, because we are restricted to the BarimaMora passage area, our focus was a bit narrow and not the other parts of the river. There is need for legal protection of the habitats which many of these species use. For example, our snook, they are very reliant on mangroves for spawning, and also other commercial species such as nebrids, microbes, or butterfish also utilize the mangroves for spawning and laying their eggs. So definitely we need to protect the existing mangroves in the region. And as I explained a bit earlier, the mangroves, we've seen a loss in the mangrove region, and this likely can be linked to the increased number of persons in the region. There are actually reports from the IMO local office of over 30,000 persons coming over from the neighboring countries. And obviously they require space for their homes, and because of this, obviously they would have to clear mangroves, not just for this, but also for agriculture and planting and so forth. So there's definitely, considering our findings, there's definitely scope to support the creation of the special protected area for the BarimaMora passage, which actually complements the findings from other study, as we can see from the vulnerable species that it supports. But not only the vulnerable species, but also the many commercial species which the local communities are reliant on for their survival. In terms of recommendation, we definitely recommend continuous monitoring of the fish population in the region. And this is essential, especially because of the habitat changes that we're seeing, more specifically the habitat loss that we're seeing in the region, and also other water quality changes that we're seeing from the Atlantic. For example, we've had reports last year of mass fish die-off in the region because of the more fresh water being released into the Atlantic than normal, creating an unsuitable condition for some species. We recommend continuous water quality monitoring in the region, and this is very important, as Matt have alluded to, because of the changes with the estuarine environment. It's a very stoic region, and you have constant changes. We also recommend a study on the aquatic invertebrates, but more specifically to target the crabs in the region. We recognize that there is a solid waste issue in the region, especially along the Barima River where we work and spend most of the time. So definitely this needs to be addressed because it can have further implications as the solid waste and the pollutants actually break down, and this can actually lead to marine and other forms of pollution. And we also recommend a study on microbial contamination in the region, because we recognize that a lot of the latrines, for example, were inundated by water, especially during the wet season where it's very high. So there are possible avenues for microbial contamination. I would like to thank the persons who made this trip possible, TriStar for funding this project, the support from the Guyana Marine Conservation Society, especially Annette has been very, very generous and supportive in this study. I'd also like to thank the team, which comprised of Michael from EMC, Maria from Natural Resources, Danielle from Fisheries Department at the Ministry of Agriculture, Kanika Goodman, which is a biology student at the University of Guyana, Devon, a local from the region, and also all of the locals who are very supportive of this study, sharing their knowledge with us all of the time, especially if we needed any guidance or, where sites are guiding us to sites that we can sample. With that, thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Mark, for that presentation on the fisheries. Just a general reminder to our participants, please, if you have any questions, leave them in the chat and we'll discuss them after the end of the presentations. Now, did you know that mangroves are a habitat for biodiversity? As we learned from Dr. Matt and Mr. Mark Ram's presentation, there's so many numerous species living above and below the mangrove ecosystems, which relies for food and shelter. Mangroves are important nurseries for fishes, crustaceans, and they support a huge variety of insects, mussels, etc. They also provide habitat for many mammals as well. But looking at our next presentation, Dr. Brian O'Shea will be talking about the bird studies. So I'm very interested to learn more about that. So Dr. Brian O'Shea is a museum-based ornithologist, which basically means the study of birds. They study the distribution and the ecology of birds of the Guyana's Shield for more than 20 years. He has participated in numerous biodiversity survey expeditions in Guyana and Suriname and led training courses for university students, young environmental professionals, and indigenous conservationists. Brian's current interest includes the development of research tourism and conservation for endangered bird species in the Rupununi region of Guyana. Brian was part of the ornithology survey team in the BarimaMora Passage, which documented a wealth of bird species, including 2 that was previously unrecorded in Guyana. So let's use our reaction button to welcome Dr. O'Shea to listen to his findings on the bird survey. Over to you, Dr. O'Shea.
Okay, thank you, Maria, and thank you for everybody for tuning in up to this point. Hope you all can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Good, good, good. Okay, let's get into this then. Okay, I'm going to talk about the bird survey that we did in the BarimaMora Passage back in October of last year. Want to especially acknowledge my collaborator in this, Leon Moore, who was instrumental in, keeping everybody's morale up during the sometimes trying conditions that we were surveying under. And he was a really great partner in all of this, and also took a lot of really outstanding photos, with some of which you'll see coming up here. Before I start, I would also like to just acknowledge NRG Holdings for funding the survey, and Annette and GMCS for spearheading the movement to preserve this area, because it is a really special place. Shanika was our on-the-ground representative there. She came out with us every day. I want to especially acknowledge our trainees from Imbotero, Ryan, Olivia, and Leslin, pictured there on the right during one of our many, many breaks from the rain. Here they are studying field guides and taking notes, and doing our best to learn about the birds when we can't actually be out watching the birds. That happened quite a bit. Also wanted a special shout out to Smokey. Smokey was a really outstanding guide. He really knows, I was told that he knew every little nook and cranny, every little creek, every gap between the trees of the entire BarimaMora Passage. And that was really true. It was really amazing to see how he could navigate through this region and just, without any obvious landmarks, know exactly where everything is. Really great guy to be with. Also, the communities of Imbotero, Smith Creek, and Morawana. We spent quite a bit of time in all 3 of them, and we greatly appreciate their hospitality during our time there. Okay, so the BarimaMora Passage, we've learned quite a bit about it up to now. It is a really vast, extensive forest. Like a lot of places in Guyana, it is, a largely forested area, only really sparsely populated, and relatively undisturbed. But the BarimaMora Passage is a very resource-rich area, and these resources sustain Mabaruma and all of the surrounding communities. And as such, the resources are extremely valuable to everybody who lives there, and also people throughout Guyana. One of the points that we've touched on already in this presentation is that the BarimaMora Passage is part of the largest mangrove ecosystem remaining in Guyana, and that is a real global asset. Mangroves around the world are critically endangered by a variety of pressures, including climate change, coastal development, everything from the development of shrimp farms to just industrial pollution in cutting for firewood. So this is a really special place. It's a really, we have a great opportunity here to really elevate its visibility on the world stage and create this special protected area. We surveyed birds in this area for a variety of reasons. One is that there was very little existing data on birds of this region. The map in the center of the screen here shows, this is a map from eBird, and it's basically showing just the accumulation. This is just from this year. It's showing the accumulation of species at various places in Guyana. And what it really does is it shows, with the exception of this one outlier out in Region 7, it shows really where most of the birding in Guyana happens and where most of the bird data that we have available to us is from. And that is basically the area around Georgetown and the immediate coastline around Georgetown, and then down along the trail through Yoakrama and then down into the Rupununi. That is where most bird tour itineraries focus, and that is where a lot of data that comes into eBird from Guyana is really focused. Areas like the New River Triangle, the highlands of Region 7, and in Region 1, they don't get very much coverage by birders, and there haven't been too many scientific surveys of birds there either. Birds are important for the ecosystem in general. I don't think I really need to tell you much about this. They provide ecosystem services, including seed dispersal. They're important for pest control. They are an important source of food in a lot of communities, and also income. Some people do derive income from trapping. And there's also, from an economic perspective, they're also important because they're the main reason that a lot of tourists, eco-tourists, come to Guyana. There are, I can't even name how many bird tour companies are operating in Guyana now, but it's a lot. And these guys come and they spend quite a bit of money to get to places to see a lot of birds that are rather difficult to see in other parts of their ranges. And the other real reason that we surveyed birds is just because there's not a lot of data. So we don't know much about the birds here. Most of the data in this region comes from Shell Beach. There were some surveys in Shell Beach up, at various points in the last 20 years. The only survey that I know of that happened in the BarimaMora Passage itself was a survey by the Smithsonian and the University of Kansas in 2002. And that was fairly near the community of Morawana. And they collected specimens over about a 2-week period along a creek that was off the Barima River, on the I guess the right side, so the northern side of the Barima River. Let's see here, my slides are not advancing for some reason. Let me try something here. Oh, there we go. Okay. So the goal of this survey, we had really 3 main goals. The first was to detect, identify, and document as many bird species as we could find and build a preliminary baseline list of birds for the BarimaMora Passage. The second was to establish transects for bird monitoring. The idea here was that we would establish these ideally 1-kilometer transects. It could be resurveyed at various times of the year and across years to generate data in a fairly standardized way to track the not only numbers of birds seasonally, but also between years, and also just to continue to try to accumulate bird species for the area. As Matt alluded to, that proved a little challenging based on the terrain. The third objective here was to train local rangers in bird identification and survey methods. So we're really keen on capacity building. If tourism is going to be a viable industry here, you need to have strong local talent. And so our goal was to cultivate that. Okay, so our methodology consisted mainly of what I would call just birding. We spent a lot of time in the boat surveying along rivers and creeks. We maneuvered our boat into whatever creeks that we could get up. We were dependent on the tides to some degree. If the tide was favorable, we could get fairly far into the forest off of the rivers. When we had the option to do so, we got out of the boat and surveyed on foot, mainly around schoolyards and farms, but also in the communities of Smith Creek, Morawana, and Imbatero themselves. And the way we collected data to be as nimble and as flexible as possible was to use a technique called the McKinnon or 10 species list technique. And this is a technique where you essentially write down all of the birds that you see, all the individual birds that you see in the order that you see them. more or less. And then what you do after that is you take these lists of birds and you break up the list into 10 species segments. So this is done after you come out of the field each day. Using those 10 species list, you can feed those into programs like Program Spadar, which is a Shiny app that allows you to generate diversity estimates based on this kind of data. All of our data were entered into eBird as well. So we have georeference points where we conducted all of our survey work. And so all of that information is viewable on eBird. If you go into eBird and look at region 1, you can see where we went birding and you can see what we saw and where. So here are our results. You can see on the bottom right there a map of the BarimaMora Passage, and above that is a series of points showing where we did our surveys. So each one of those blue dots is a eBird locality that we surveyed. So we covered the area quite well. We covered it pretty thoroughly. You can see a clustering of points around Morawana and Smith Creek up in the top of the screen. That's because we spent quite a bit of time in those areas. You also see a couple points around Mabaruma itself. The data from those points were not included in our analyses because Mabaruma proper is not within the boundaries of the SPA. So moving on here. So here's what our results were. We had 187 species that we observed during the time that we were there. And then looking through historical data, I picked up 57 additional species. Most of those were from the Smithsonian and University of Kansas expedition in 2002. So that brings the total of species known to occur in the BarimaMora Passage up to 244. Our 10 species list data, we had 178 10 species lists. Those contain over 7,000 individuals of 180 species. And feeding that into the diversity estimator, it generated a variety of estimators. The highest one was the Chow 2 estimator. And so the official predicted number that I'm putting out here is 256 species. That was the highest confidence interval that we could get. A lot of the estimators actually predicted lower diversity than we observed if you factor in those 57 additional species. So they somewhat underperformed. I think a lot of the reason for that was because we spent a lot of our time in early successional habitats is what we would call them. So areas around schools and villages where there's a lot of ecological generalists and the avifauna doesn't really vary from one place to another. In other words, we did not spend a lot of time in taller forest away from the rivers where we were likely to pick up a lot more species. And that was mainly because of the difficulty of getting through the forest and also the tides inhibiting us from getting up too far up some of the creeks that ran off of the main rivers. The most abundant species by far was orange-winged parrot, a really, truly impressive number of orange-winged parrots in this area. We had over 2,000 individual orange-winged parrots on our 10 species list. That's over a quarter of all birds that we counted were orange-winged parrots. And that species, along with crested oripendula and scarlet ibis, accounted for about 50% of all birds that we saw. So there are a few species there that are especially abundant, and they were really spectacular to see. The most widespread species was the humble bananaquit. This is a small bird. It's with a striped head, a yellow below. They're common all over Guyana. They're common in Georgetown and just about any settlement. 45% of our 10 species list have bananaquit on them. So there really are a truly impressive number of bananaquits in this area. The highlights of our survey were these two species. First and foremost, these are new records for Guyana. The first one on the left here is the belted kingfisher. This was reported for Guyana previously. Belted kingfisher is a species that breeds in North America during the non-breeding season, so roughly from October to April. They disperse down through the southern US and then out across the Gulf of Mexico and along the coast of Central America and really throughout the Caribbean basin. They're fairly regular on Trinidad, but they don't seem to get into continental South America very much beyond the Orinoco Delta, basically. There are only a couple of records for the Guianas. I don't even know if there are any confirmed records for either Suriname or French Guiana. We encountered belted kingfisher on the first day out from Mabaruma. We encountered one right at the junction of the confluence of the Barima and Aruca rivers. There it was. And we ended up seeing 2 or 3 more of them over the course of the time we were there. Leon got this excellent photo. And so we can now confidently say that belted kingfishers do occur in Guyana, at least in region 1. And the really exciting species that we got in addition to that was the guy on the right. This is the black-chested tyrant. This is a really mysterious bird that I was hoping we would find. About 15 years ago, I did some field work in the Orinoco Delta and I saw black-chested tyrant there. And so I surmised that there might be black-chested tyrants in this region because we're quite close to the Orinoco Delta here. And on our first morning out, when we actually had good weather, I heard one and we ended up tracking it down and calling it in. We ended up seeing several more of them during the time that we were there. This is a really sort of enigmatic bird. It's very spottily distributed and it's highly, highly sought after by bird watchers. This is a bird that you can never really count on seeing anywhere you go. In Suriname, there's only one record. It was from 40 years ago. It has not been seen since. There's never been one seen in French Guiana. So, and the remaining localities for this species are scattered around eastern Brazil. So it's it's really special to find them in the BarimaMora Passage. And not only that, they seem to be fairly common there. So if a birder is coming to Guyana and looking for black-chested tyrant, this would probably be a pretty good place to go because it's a pretty sure bet that you'll see them there. So that was really exciting, even more so that the Smithsonian team did not find black-chested tyrant when they were there 20 years ago. So pretty nice to find these, and it's great to know that you can continue visiting a place like this and continue to find new species. And I will say, I'll say now that I think that if there were additional surveys in this area, there are several other species of birds that are found in the Orinoco Delta that have not been recorded in Guyana. And I think there's a good chance that they could be recorded in Guyana with a little extra survey effort. Okay. A few other special birds we saw, or some uncommon species that we found here that are not often seen elsewhere in Guyana. One of them on the left here is a swallow tanager that we saw a group of them in Morawana. Neat little bird, but kind of hard to find in Guyana. It's got a wide range over the Amazon basin and elsewhere in South America, but it is just not something, I've been birding in Guyana for a long time and you just don't see swallow tanagers in many places. So it was neat to see those. And then the guy on the right is velvet-fronted grackle. This is a fairly common bird in region 1, but it's only in region 1. This bird is not found elsewhere in Guyana. So if you're coming to Guyana as a bird watcher, you will need to go to region 1 if you want to see this species. We found them to be quite common, and that's one of the special birds of this area. Okay, so the take-home message here is that the BarimaMora Passage harbors a diverse bird community. It's probably well in excess of 256 species. If you go to, some of the more traditional forested areas, you could find 400 to 500 species. So we think that it's highly likely that there's at least 100 more species than we found, and probably even more than that. And the reason for that, as Matt alluded to, is that the BarimaMora Passage seems to be a transition zone between a mangrove ecosystem and these interior forest ecosystems. And so it has species of birds that are typical of both ecosystems. That's a recipe for really high diversity and a really rich avifauna. As I mentioned before, we think our survey data might be biased in favor of widespread generalists. So we do recommend conducting another survey in the dry season when we can get into slightly drier forest that's away from the mangrove areas to really drive up the species list. A lot of the species that were found by the Smithsonian group in 2002 were these forest species that are quite common elsewhere in Guyana, but they're more rainforest, what I would call rainforest species that do not tend to occur in a mangrove ecosystem. The weather was terrible during our trip, and this is a position we were frequently forced to adopt, ducking under the leatherette to try to ward off the rain. We spent a lot of time hunkered down from the rain. We spent a lot of time in Morawana on the ferry landing, waiting for the rain to pass. we ended up losing from anywhere from a couple of hours to almost an entire day to rain during the survey, which, considering that we were surveying in October, was unusual. We were expecting it to be much drier. So another reason that we may have underestimated diversity on our survey was just because we had really bad weather, and that's something we can't control. Another reason for a dry season survey. Few highlights of the avifauna here. Highly abundant, or highly visible and abundant avifauna in the BarimaMora Passage. This, and I'm going to talk for the rest of the time here mainly about the potential for tourism, because I think that this is really the key thing here, is to note that when you have this abundance of birds, abundance of birds is one thing, but if you can't see them, then the area becomes less desirable to tourists. And in this case, in the BarimaMora Passage, you have a lot of birds that are very easy to see. And that's great, especially because not everybody is a hardcore bird watcher. A lot of people enjoy seeing birds, but it's not as enjoyable if you can't really see the birds. And in this case, we have a lot of really easy to see birds, and some of them present in large numbers. We have high diversity from the different forest types, high abundance of things like parrots, oropendulas, scarlet ibises, herons, and birds of prey. Big things, easy to photograph, easy to see. And then we have this special bird here, the crimson-hooded manakin. This is just an illustration of a species that is not really found along Guyana's main birding and tourism circuit, at least not in the numbers that you would find them in Region 1. This is a swamp forest species. It's really not found in the interior. It has a really spectacular plumage. The males have a spectacular plumage. It has a really interesting display. And near the village of Smith Creek, we were able to watch these birds displaying, and that's where Leon got this photo. Really nice bird to find, and just an example of some of the things that you could see in Region 1 that you might not be able to see elsewhere. So the next steps, as far as the birds go, is to continue local capacity building and tourism development. We think that there's a lot of potential for bird tourism development here, and also the opportunities to train local guides to help take people to where the birds are. We do think more bird surveys could yield additional new species for Guyana. I can think of at least 2 off the top of my head that I'm fairly sure occur in that area that we just didn't happen to see when we were there. And the other thing we would like to do is promote more use of the apps. These are Cornell Lab apps, eBird and Merlin, to broaden access to data and resources. These are apps that you can load on your phone. Merlin is an ID aid, and eBird is a way to record data and build a database, an online database of bird species in the region, which in turn can really, because these apps are, because eBird in particular is used by visiting bird watchers to kind of plan their itineraries, it's really beneficial to put bird data into eBird just to showcase the bird diversity of this area. We had some unanticipated issues with offline functionality of those apps when we were in the field. I've heard from Cornell that they're working to resolve them, so hopefully we can get that resolved soon, and we can do some more trainings in the future with those resources. And that is all I have. So I would be happy to take any questions about that.
All right, thank you, Dr. O'Shea. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. All right, so I just want to say that when looking back at Brian's photo when everybody was in the rain, so I was with Mark on our fishery studies, and we had like 2 or 3 days of rain out there, but we tried to do as much as we can during that study, and whether rain or sun, we still work. It was all part of the experience. So coming back to again, no matter what career that we have, research unlocks the unknown. It lets you explore the world from different perspectives, and it fuels a deeper understanding in some of the areas. Research helps you to, it's part of our success. It expands your knowledge. It gives you, more information. It builds your credibility. It gives you the curiosity. For example, like the BarimaMora Passage, right? We did not know about it. All we thought is, hey, it's a dense forest. What's happening there? So we had these 3 incredible researchers that went out there with their team, and they presented, or they found, some incredible findings. They provided a wealth of knowledge on the presence of biodiversity in the BarimaMora Passage Special Protected Area. And it indicated keystone species, several giants in Guyana, the discovery of new species, and species that are ICUN red listed. The BarimaMora Passage Special Protected Area is a unique habitat for multiple species of freshwater and estuarine fishes, as Mark would have said. This area would support many commercial species that are vulnerable, making it important for the livelihood for the locals in that community. And as Mark would have stated, that there's an urgent need for legal protection of this area to preserve their existing mangrove, biodiversity, and ecosystem services while maintaining the livelihood of the local. But nevertheless, I know that our participants are very eager that they have some questions here that we can start discussing. And if you have any questions, you feel free to raise your hands and we'll unmute you. We have our facilitator, Nathan, and Nathan, Sarah, and Tajani will also assist in this. All right. So we have a question here from Ariana Harris to Mark and Matt. In terms of tourism, in a similar way to the birds, do you guys think there is a potential for tourism-related activity in the BarimaMora Passage? For example, large mammal spotting tours or sport fishing? So Mark and Matt, over to you.
Mark, you want to talk about sport fishing first?
Sure, I'll go first. Yes, Ariane, definitely there is potential for sports fishing. I was actually amazed at the size of the fishes that I've seen in this study, because I've seen similar fishes along the coast of Guyana, but I had never seen such large fishes. And we find that most of the time, the persons who do the sports fishing, actually, they go after the larger fishes. And this would be very good, but also we have to, at the same time, we would also have to be very careful, especially not to put any more pressure on some species such as the Atlantic tarpon that I mentioned, or rockofam, which is already vulnerable. And this is one of the large size fish that persons may also want to go after. But apart from that, yes, there is great potential for sports fishing, as well as fish aside, the other biodiversity that's found in this area, and even the pristine ecosystem and the mangroves in this particular region, which is quite unique in comparison to the others found in regions 2 to 6.
Sure, and related to mammals, Ariane, thanks for your question. So mammals are always, the large mammals are always the hardest species to see, no matter which part of South America you're in, Rupununi, BarimaMora, Ecuador, Peru, anywhere. Everybody wants to see jaguars, and they don't like to make themselves seen. So that is always a challenge in South America, is seeing those, especially the cats, because they are very secretive, and they tend to avoid places where humans are frequenting. That said, I think that the BarimaMora Passage is uniquely suited for a few species that are of interest to tourists. So I mentioned that we saw giant river otters while we were there. Those are always a favorite of tourists, and some people go to the Rupununi, for example, just to see a giant river otter. So I think there is potential for river-based tourism in the BarimaMora Passage. I didn't mention that we did see West Indian manatees while we were there. Certainly a species that that tourists are interested in seeing, and Annette and Miss Odesi from PAC were kind enough to coordinate a visit to Shell Beach. Fernando and I had never been there, so we went out to Shell Beach for a day, and we did see Guyanan dolphins on our way out. And that, of course, the marine mammals are always a favorite among tourists and one that people would like to see. We did see capuchins, squirrel monkeys, and howler monkeys during the surveys from the boats. And so I think that, those species are also, so definitely of interest as to your kind of general wildlife tourists. I know that you're serious birders that would be going and targeting some of the species that Brian was mentioning and that Leon might carry on his tourists. They may see a mammal and just wanted to get out of the way because it's blocking a bird. But there's certainly a number of species that I think would be of interest to tourists who are doing sort of general wildlife riverine tours, and you would get a chance to see a number of the large mammals.
All right, thank you, Matt and Mark. I hope that answers Ariane's question. Annette, I see you have your hand raised. You can unmute.
Actually, I had my question in the box, but thanks, Maria. First of all, I just want to say thank you to the three guys for 3 phenomenal presentations. You really re-energized me in terms of the way forward. And my question was to Brian, how soon can we get you back to do the dry season survey?
Tomorrow. Anytime. I'd love to come back. Obviously, it's getting into rainy season now. I was really surprised that it was so wet in October, and that was really it really, I think, put a damper on things. But if we could get there in a time when the water was just a little bit easier to move around over land, that would be really great. So yeah, we can talk about it.
All right, great. Thank you. Annette, you have a next question there?
No,
Yeah.
I was actually trying to answer Brian, but somebody muted me. Yeah, Brian, definitely can we plan for that, because I really feel that indeed the amount of time you lost because of the horrendous rain, we need to make back up. So I would want to say that let's go ahead and start planning for that dry season survey as soon as you're available.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you. So there's a question for Brian and Matt. Can sustainable harvest level be calculated for species that are targeted for trade? So Brian or Matt, you can answer that.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I was looking for it in the chat. I didn't see it.
It came directly.
Okay.
So the question is, can sustainable harvest level be calculated for species that are targeted for trade?
Yeah.
A difficult question.
Yeah.
I was letting Brian jump in.
I don't want to say yes, and I don't want to say no. I think you need to be very careful with it. I think that, like a lot of things, that people set hunting quotas here for animals in the United States. If everybody were to harvest that many animals, there wouldn't be any left. But I at the same time, I'm concerned sometimes when I see some of the harvest quotas that have been set for parrots, for instance, for Guyana. That's a lot of birds, and these are long-lived birds that don't have very high reproductive rates. And so I think you'd have to look at it on a species by species basis. And I think you'd have to constantly be assessing and refining your harvest estimates like they do in the US for a lot of game animals. But also most importantly, you need to enforce any regulations that you have with wildlife harvesting. I think those are the real issues you have to address beyond just setting a quota.
Okay, great. Matt,
I
do you
think
want
for but as far as the mammals go, I think just sort of partially echoing what Brian says, in places where they do have fairly well managed populations of large mammals, like deer in the United States, for instance, typically those are accompanied by 100-year-old data sets that contain sometimes millions of data points, and so there's a high level of reporting by hunters, and you can track harvest levels, by age class and sex and across years, and correlated with weather patterns and all sorts of things that allows you to sort of over time refine your harvest quotas. Actually, in the US, white-tailed deer, for example, were nearly hunted to extinction in the early 1900s. And so the harvest quotas that were later set were a reaction to mistakes that were made at the beginning. And so, you know, sort of wildlife managers keep going, oh, set it at this. Oh, that was too much. We can monitor next year. Oh, let's lower it a little bit. Okay, that was good. And we're raising, and you're sort of adjusting over time. One of the challenges with tropical mammals is that it's really only now that we're starting to get an idea of what the impact of varying levels of harvest are. And the reason for that is because tropical mammals walk around in the rainforest where it's very hard to see them and in very rugged terrain. White-tailed deer walk around in the open eating grass, and it's very easy to, all you need is a Jeep and some binoculars to see them. With bush deer, you might get lucky and see one a year. And so they're very hard to monitor, but tools like camera traps are allowing us to take a peek into the lives of these secretive tropical forest mammals when we don't have to be physically present. And so the studies that are going on across South America are starting to give us an idea of what are the impacts of varying levels of harvest. But I think that having really specific levels, we could say you can take 100 bush deer and that'll be sustainable forever, we're not quite there yet. And it'll probably take us a little while to sort of get there.
Great. I hope that answers the question. There's a next question for you, Matt. You mentioned the presence of the West Indians manatee. Is there any estimate on the population around the BarimaMora Passage?
No, not at all. I had heard from other people, Wally Prince, who had done some previous work for Protected Areas Commission in Shell Beach. Miss Annette had seen manatees around the area before. And then in talking, Brian talked about Smokey, and he was our guide as well. And he sort of knew the whole place back to front. And he told us that manatees were around. We saw one. So I know that there's at least one in BarimaMora Passage, but I haven't ever heard of a study of manatees going on in the area, or even much study of manatees in Guyana, other than the ones that are in the national park. People study those every weekend. But I think that it's certainly an area of interest. I work and live in Florida, and there are hundreds of people that are studying the manatee population that's here, and we're at the very northern extent of their range. And so in the core of the range of West Indian manatees, it would be great to see some students doing some work on them. And I'm hoping that a student who's working with me here might be working with GMCS in the future to do some work on manatees as well. But yeah, I don't know. There hasn't been much work done to my knowledge in the past.
All right, great. Thank you. We have another question here in the chat from Mahendra. He said, well, he's congratulating you guys on the presentation. And this presentation goes to Mark or anyone else. Can you comment on the carbon sequestration potential of the mangrove in the BarimaMora Passage? Do you have any sense of how much carbon is stored there versus other forest type in Guyana, and what's the economic value of this might be? So the question goes to Mark. You want me to read it back again for you?
I'm seeing it in the chat as well. Yes. As far as I'm aware, there are no estimates of the carbon from this specific region of Guyana, but I do know that there are other estimates from the other coastal regions where the mostly black mangroves exist. Recent estimates actually showed that some of our restored mangrove areas where the black mangroves have been planted in monocultures have actually have higher levels of biomass in comparison to natural mangroves versus other ecosystems. But that's a really good question, because the composition of mangroves in Region 1 is completely different from the other regions. Having more red mangroves having those trees that having a higher with higher ball density, definitely suspect that there will be higher levels of biomass in this particular area and in these species in comparison to the others. So there's definitely scope for research to estimate the carbon potential of these mangroves in the region.
All right, thanks, Mark. All right, so this is a question to Matt, Brian, and Mark. So during your studies along the BarimaMora Passage, and well, Mark would have mentioned it, you know, what was the most dominant mangrove species along that area?
Are you talking about what species of mangrove?
Yeah.
Red. My understanding was that the white mangrove is further out toward the coast, and that most of the mangroves along the Barima River, at least in the Ruka River down from Mabaruma, is mostly red mangrove. But I've been struggling with this for years. I can identify birds, but when I look at these trees, I can't tell one mangrove from the other. So I know that a lot of people can do it very quickly, but I've always struggled with the two.
Okay.
So I don't really know.
All right, thanks. I see Annette has her hand up. So Annette.
Just to add to the earlier question about the mangroves, Mark, remember Stephen Munsami had done a economic evaluation assessment of the BarimaMora Passage mangroves in 2020 when you guys went out with Joe Ryan. So we could probably share that report with the person who asked the question. But just to add as well that apart from the mangroves itself, this area has a lot of wetlands and peatlands, and those wetlands and peatlands store even more carbon than even the mangroves. So in essence, this BarimaMora Passage with the Shellfish Protected Area is one of the largest blue carbon sinks nationally. And that's a very important point to just basically share. Also, Mark, the red mangroves, as you said, are more abundant in the area, I guess because the area is more riverine than coastal. So I would think that the majority of the black mangroves are found along the coastline, whereas the riverine areas are mainly red as well.
And some of the biggest mangrove trees that I've ever seen in my life. We have a fair number of mangroves here in Florida where I live now, but almost all of them are in tiny patches in between massive developments, coastal developments in Florida, and most of the trees are still fairly immature and have been planted from restoration. And so one of the things that really struck me about the BarimaMora Passage was just the one that the mangroves went, as you were driving down the river, it was just sheer mangroves. They were going on and on and on and on and on as you were driving. And then also the height of the trees, that there were immense mangroves that must be very, very old. And so I think it's one of those things that there are probably few places left in the world, sadly, where you could see an intact mangrove habitat like this that has lots of very large trees. And so another reason that sort of warrants this special protected area status.
Yes, Matt, and also Tom Hollowell, the late Tom Hollowell had done a lot of study in the mangroves in the Winey Peninsula as well. After the El Nino fires of 1998, a huge swathe had burnt out. And he had some photographs of some of those black mangroves where the girth of that tree was several feet, almost like 3 to 4 feet wide. It was astonishing how big they can actually get once they are left undisturbed, you know? That is another very exciting area to study for future researchers as well.
Indeed, indeed. Potential research coming up soon. All right. Can we have two more questions? If you don't want to type, feel free to unmute and you can ask your questions. All right, I see there's no more questions coming in. So I'll kindly ask you guys to turn on your videos so we can do a little picture moment. And Sarah, she will do this screenshots of that. So we'll do one with a serious face and the other with a funny face, all right? You can use your reaction to, you know, to make it look fun, maybe a smiley face, a laughy face, something to sort. All right, Sarah, whenever you're ready, let me know.
3, 2, 1, stay mangroves. Got it.
All right, let's do another one just in case.
Got it.
All right, you got it. So now let's do a funny one. You can do maybe some hand fingers or use the little reaction. Let us know when you're ready. 1, 2, 3.
Thank you.
All right, great. So, all right, I don't see any more questions. All right, so thank you so much to all the researchers presenting their finding of the BarimaMora passage. And I would like to also extend gratitude for all the participants for listening this evening. Thank you so much. And this brings us to the end of our webinar for today. Good evening, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Maria and Sarah, Nathan, everyone else who helped.
Yes,
Appreciate
thank
it.
you all.
Great job,
Yeah.
guys.
Great presentation. It was very interesting to be learning a lot from the mammal studies and the birds as well too. I've never done a bird studies before, but it was very interesting to see those discoveries that you have there.
Yeah.
And on behalf of GMCS, we look forward to working with you guys and looking forward for more research from you all too.
Yeah, that was my first time in Region 1 also, and it was great. So I'd love to come back.
Yeah, the same here. Well, now that we have the Matera Research Station, I guess instead of staying at Broom's Hotel, now we can stay over there. So it'll be a different experience.
I was going to say that the research station looks really nice.
Yeah, it's coming along.
Yeah.
I think we do have one researcher up there presently that is doing his PhD. His name is Bob. He's looking at the canoes, the history of making canoes and stuff like that. And it's very interesting because, it's something new and we've never done any of that study here in Guyana. So we look forward for his finding at the end of the 3-4 months that he have here in Guyana.
Very cool.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess we'll see you guys soon. Bye-bye.
Sounds good.
All right, everyone.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.